Welcome to the Prioritizing Prevention Translating Science to Practice podcast. Our goal is to prioritize prevention conversations that matter. Our topic for today is Unmasking Masculinity, Redefining Violence Prevention, with special guest Glenn Harris. Now here's our host, Holly Raffle.
Hello, and welcome to episode 8 of season 2 of Prioritizing Prevention, Translating Science to Practice. This podcast is hosted by the Ohio Center of Excellence for Behavioral Health Prevention and Promotion. My name is Holly Raffle, and I have the privilege of serving as the faculty director of the center. This month, we're diving into a crucial topic: healthy masculinity and its role in preventing intimate partner violence. Today's podcast will explore the importance of challenging harmful gender stereotypes and promoting positive, equitable relationships. To shed a light on this issue, we're joined by the esteemed Glenn Harris, Director of Prevention at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. Glenn brings a wealth of experience and expertise to the conversation. In his work at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network, Glenn is a dedicated advocate for men and boys, focusing on issues such as fatherhood, mentoring, and reentry programs. His work addresses the harmful effects of toxic masculinity, particularly within athletics and fraternities, aimed to create positive and supporting environments for all genders. In this episode, we'll discuss the impact of harmful masculinity on individuals, families, and communities. We'll also explore strategies for promoting healthy masculinity and fostering gender equality. Then we'll wrap up by discussing the role that preventionists can play in preventing intimate partner violence. Join us as we delve into this important topic with Glenn Harris. Welcome to the podcast, Glenn.
Hello, thank you for having me.
To get us started, our listeners really enjoy getting to know our guests sort of beyond the bio. So we always hold some time at the beginning of the show where you can share with our listeners something about who you are beyond your bio. So maybe a little bit about what your work looks like on the daily, which part of your work you enjoy the most, or a little nugget about who you are as a person. Whatever you'd like to share with our listeners.
Yeah, I think I would just like to share that my work is my life experience. Yeah, I'm a father of 3 boys. My boys are 10, 20, and 30 years old, so all 10 years apart. So a wealth of knowledge, just, being a male myself, raising 3 boys, being steeped in athletic communities, fraternal communities. I was part of the community, that when we talk about engaging men and boys to prevent violence, I was part of some of those communities. I was part of, the culture that contributed to the violence, and have had an opportunity to do some work and learn some great information, resources, and knowledge that, kind of helped me transition to the young man I used to be, and now be a leader in the community and help other young men, go a different path.
Well, thank you, Glenn, and welcome. And I am a mama of 2 boys, one who is turning 18 today, matter of fact, and one who's 20, both involved in the athletic community. So a lot of what you were saying in your bio resonates with me as someone who is raising boys to young men. The Ohio Domestic Violence Network may be a new resource for some of our listeners. So to ground our conversation, what do you think of starting with a little bit of background information on ODVN and how the prevention community can get plugged into the amazing work that's going on there?
Absolutely. So all across the country, every state has what they call a state coalition on domestic violence. Every state has a coalition on sexual violence. ODVN happens to be the state coalition for domestic violence. There's also a sister organization that we call OHESV, which is the Ohio Association to End Sexual Violence. In addition to that, some states, have what they call combined entities where they both do sexual and domestic violence. Here in Ohio, we have chosen to separate those two things as 2 separate missions. However, we do collaborate, do a lot of work together to address understanding that the same risk and protective factors, overlap both disciplines.
And how long have you been with ODVN, Glenn?
Personally, I've been with ODVN about 6 years. Prevention in the realm of domestic violence is fairly new. About 15 years ago, the CDC kind of took the lead and said, hey, we're doing a great job of reacting to the domestic violence we're seeing across the country. What can we do to start preventing some of the domestic violence? So that work kind of started about 15 years ago, led by the CDC of our federal government. In addition to the prevention work that I do here at ODVN, We also do provide services. We provide education and training for all of the member programs across the state, which are most of the shelters across the state and those that offer domestic violence resources and advocacy. We also offer various different housing services. For example, we'll offer relocation and safety assistance. So if someone is in trouble, can't get into a shelter, we can help them relocate. We even offer a hotel program. So if they need a short hotel stay, while we can get that figured out, we'll offer that. We'll also give survivors legal assistance, making sure that they have the legal representation they need through the process. As in addition to various different advocacy services and the prevention work that I do.
So many things. Thank you for your public service to Ohioans. So, while conversations about domestic violence often center around women as victims, why is it equally important to address the role of men in masculinity in preventing and addressing this issue?
Unfortunately, we live in a culture and society where the vast majority of perpetrators are men. So if we're going to ever put a stop to it or make a huge decrease in the amount of violence that we see against women, we have to have conversations with men. I will also like to say that it's not the majority of men, it's the minority of men. We're talking about a small population, 10, 15, 20% of men who are able to commit these types of violence. But the other 80% of men remain silent, right? So we have to encourage that 80% of men to speak up, encourage those men in the 20% say, hey, that's not acceptable male masculine behavior. And oftentimes it's a 20% who often define what masculinity looks like in our communities and cultures because they typically become, quote unquote, the often alpha males, typically is what we'll call them in many communities, many societies. And then the men around them will behave and act mirror some of those same behaviors, thinking that that is the acceptable male standard for that particular community, society, whatever it may be.
It's so interesting to really dive into not only the role of men, but also recognizing that it's not all men, yet all men have some responsibility, right? And I really appreciate you detailing that. And how can focusing on these aspects contribute to a more comprehensive and effective approach to combating domestic violence?
Yeah, so something that came up with two things. First is we're doing a statewide campaign called the Ohio Healthy Masculinity Campaign. We call that Know Better, Do Better, Be Better. So we're encouraging men to know better, know about the knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors we know lead to violence. Once you know better, we ask you to do better in your everyday life, in your everyday relationships. Once we know better, do better, we can all be better in our relationships, homes, and communities. The second thing I came up with, I call it the 3 E's. We have to work with young men to develop empathy. We have to help them develop emotions because we're taught from a very young age as men we shouldn't have emotions, and the ones that we are okay to display are typically the negative type of emotions. And the last thing is efficacy. We want to make sure we build up their ability to go in and change what their neighborhoods, communities, their networks, friends, what that looks like. So we want to build their confidence and ability to say, you know what? I can change how this looks in my particular community. I can change how this looks on my campus.
And from our background conversations, we learned that some of your passions lie within changing the way violence is normalized in society. And you alluded to that a little bit in your previous response. So, can you give an example of the way violence is commonly normalized?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we see, there's a huge social media phenomenon where these huge acts of violence happen and they're continuously reshown and reshown and reshown on social media. To give you a perfect example, I can't tell you how many times I had to watch the George Floyd situation back in 2020, the amount of times it was shared, the amount of times, and that's traumatizing. Not only that, it normalizes it. It's like, you know what, hey, we get used to seeing that type of violence, and it's almost like it's a day-to-day occurrence, right? In some communities, it's language. So in some urban communities, there's a particular shirt that young men wear, and they call it a wife beater. Imagine young people growing up hearing that phrase over and over and over, wife beater, wife beater, wife beater. It normalizes it. You grow up, you get into this violent relationship, you get into this violent situation, you're like, oh, well, wife beater, I heard it all my whole life. Maybe it's normal, right? And it's small things like that. It's laughing at the jokes, whether it's a sexist joke, whether it's a homophobic joke. When we laugh at them, we're contributing to that attitude. We're contributing to that behavior. And we're saying to that person who's telling that joke, I support what you're saying. What you said was funny and I it's okay, right? And we have to build up individuals who are able to say, whether it's in the locker room, whether it's in the cafeteria, and say, hey, that's not funny. Hey, why are you speaking about women like that? Right? We got to build up young men who are able and confident to step up when needed.
It's interesting. I was traveling with my son's sports team over the weekend, and after our game, we had a late game. We come back to the hotel. It's about 10:30 at night, and the law enforcement's there. And there was a domestic violence situation, and we were in one of those hotels where if you sat down in the lobby, you could see all the rooms, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
I don't want to give the brand name on the podcast, but you get the idea. And then, so we're sitting there with all of the young men who are 18U, so they're 17 and 18, and we brought pizzas back and whatever. And you saw law enforcement take the individual who's, the perpetrating the violence up in a glass elevator, right? So you could see the law enforcement accompanying the individual to get their things and then come back down. And that was just an example of a time where I saw a group of dads really step up and just say, "Hey guys, let's talk about this." And some of the young men were like, "Hey, I've done um, some volunteer work in a domestic violence shelter," and then talking about how the values that they learn on their athletic teams show how to take care of women. And so it's interesting that that was a way to undo that normalization instead of sensationalizing it, having them be on their phones and kind of videoing what was happening. I saw a group of men try to undo that normalization by let's talk about this instead of gawking at it. So I don't know if that was a right or wrong thing of those dads, but it seemed to be very powerful in the moment. So what else can be done to try and undo normalization?
I think the example you just used is perfect. I mean, we have to understand as a society that not many of our young people grow up in a household where healthy relationships are modeled, right? So if you grow up in a situation where you see violence, you see domestic violence, you see these things, it becomes normal. It becomes, acceptable part of relationships. I've seen young people who get I'll give you a perfect example. I'll never forget this. This was some years ago. I think my son was probably 11, 12 years old. We're at a friend's cookout during the summer. It's probably about 3 or 4 years ago. One of the young boys was chasing a young girl around the party. And at some point, I don't think he aggressively pushed her, but he was trying to catch up with her, but kind of, put his hands on her so she fell, tumbled a little bit. The girl got upset, went to her dad. The dad's like, what's going on with the kid? He was kind of rough. And then the other dad of the young man says, "Oh, I think he just took a liking to her, blah, blah, blah." And I'm like, no, I don't think we want to teach young men that we like people and then this violence comes out. No, that's not how we, display attraction, right? But some young people grow up in those environments and say, "Oh, you know what? That's a part of love. That's part of relationships." So having those fathers step in and say, "Hey, this is not acceptable behavior. I'm sorry if you guys have seen this. Sorry you've seen it today, but this is not how two grown adults should be in a relationship. Relationships are meant to be healthy." It's a good time to have conversations with young people like about green flags and red flags. I remember just a couple years ago, there was a social media trend where they were making light of the whole green flag, red flag situation. Like people will go on social media, Facebook, and say, her breath stinks, red flag, red flag, red flag. And I'm like, no, that's not what red flags are. It's like red flag is a much more serious situation. And let's have a real conversation what red flags are and what green flags are. Let's have a good conversation what healthy relationships and bad relationships are. So it's not getting lost on social media because you guys are making fun of it, making light of it.
And I've heard you reference the need to, quote, bring the masculinity down in order to have vulnerable conversations with men and boys. And I hear you kind of talking about that a little bit. Why is this so important?
I'm very hesitant to lift that up too high. And the reason being, I don't want any young person, any male that's listening to this to get the idea or to get the notion that there's something innately wrong about being a male or being a man. That's not what we're saying at all. There is a subset of behaviors that men typically display in the company of other men when they're trying to jockey for like position, this totem pole of manhood. Everybody wants to climb up. So we're always doing things to kind of climb up this totem pole, right? I love masculinity. I love my manhood. There's nothing wrong with being a man. I think what we need to do is define redefine as a culture and society what that truly means. The difficulty in that is that we are living in a social political system where we literally just had a president of the United States who's been on record saying, grab her by the you know what, right? So when we have a social political kind of culture out there that's like this, it's that much more important we start having the conversations with the young people that it is not okay, it is not acceptable to grab anybody by anything, right? We should not be grabbing people, let alone by their private areas. That's completely unacceptable. It's completely unacceptable as a male to use your privilege or power to bully, to get the things that you want in life. And oftentimes as young men, that's what we're taught. We're taught that on a sports field. We're taught to be dominant. We're taught to be competitive. We're taught to win at all costs, right? And then oftentimes we take that into our relationships, and that becomes the recipe for disaster.
It's interesting because what I'm hearing is we really need to look at it as a both and, right? We need to celebrate the masculinity that we have when it's expressed in a healthy way, but how do we recognize and see when we need to turn down unhealthy or unhelpful masculinity?
100%. I've done a lot of research on what they call the stages in contemplation of change, right? There's different stages of change. There are going to be some guys out there that are completely resistant to this type of education. The moment you start talking about masculinity and things like that, they don't want to hear it. They're not going to say, you're not going to take away my masculinity, so on and so forth. They're just very gun-ho about their masculinity. I don't want to challenge that, right? I'm absolutely okay with you holding on to your masculinity. I'm off. I'm okay with you having pride in your ethnicity, your gender, and all those different things. Absolutely okay with that. However, I do want to challenge you to look at a subset of behaviors that you may display in very particular unique situations. When you're in company of men, when you're trying to, jockey position, when you're trying to win attention of a female. And then also let's talk about the situations where that has hurt you. One of the situations or one of the questions I like to ask guys is, tell me about a time you had to prove you were a man, right? And typically guys that think about that, usually what surfaces up is their first experiences or encounters with sex, some situation where they felt like they had to go to fisticuffs with another guy just to prove that, hey, you're not going to bully me, or all these type of things. These are types of stories that come up, but we're continuously, daily putting men and boys in situations where they have to prove their manhood, right? And how do we take a step back from that? The second part of that is, how do we create a culture and a society where young men and boys feel safe and okay to share their experiences? For a short time prior to this work, I worked in the sex offender population. And one of the things I quickly discovered working with that population is that 2/3 of those men, literally 60% of these guys, were victims themselves, never got the help or treatment that they needed due to the situation that they suffered, and then became perpetrators later on in life. Oftentimes, the first time that they've told that story is to a detective the day they got arrested. They say, "Oh, that happened to me, and this happened when I was 12." Well, it's too late. Now you're a criminal. You're in a bad situation. But it's all because as a community, as a society, they didn't feel safe. They didn't feel comfortable telling that story, knowing they would be emasculated. If I'm a 12-year-old boy and I say, hey, I was sexually assaulted by, rather it's a family member, an older male in the community on the street, the first thing everyone does is look at me and says, well, what did you do to attract that type of attention? Why didn't you fight them off? You're a guy, right? And all these questions start coming into place that challenge our own masculinity and manhood. So we don't get the help or attention that we need in that situation because we won't even tell.
And I can see where it might be easy to only think of messaging or talking about masculinity with men and boys. But I also wonder if there are messages and approaches to talk about masculinity to women and girls, because we all play a role in creating these healthy environments.
Oh, absolutely. We work in a lot of school settings, college campuses, and we're always talking to guys, surveying guys, and one thing that we're finding is that guys are often behaving in the ways that women expect them to. For example, there's a belief out there, I know we've all heard it, good guys don't win. Like we've heard that before, right? We grow up hearing that. So as a young man, why do you want to be a good guy? If I'm not going to win, if I'm not going to get the girl, if I'm not going to get the money, if I'm not going to get all the cool things I aspire to have, there's no incentive to be good, right? Um, One of the conversations I have with people all the time is I remember growing up back in the 80s, early 90s, and we had films on TV like, I don't know if you remember Porky's,
Mhm.
Animal House, and all these very hyper masculine type movies. I can't remember the last time I turned on the TV and seen anything like that, right? That's our culture and our society stepping up saying, we're done. The boys will be boys thing is done. We're putting it into it. That's why we see cancel culture. That's why we see the Me Too movement and all these things surfacing, because it's our community, it's our society saying, hey, enough is enough. The boys can no longer just be the boys. The boys are going to be held accountable. Part of that conversation is also talking to the girls. It's not always about how much power a guy has. It doesn't have to be how much money a guy has. There are other attributes and other values as young women we should be looking up to, right? But if you look at television, if you look at social media, it says go find the guy with the money, go find the guy with the power, go find the guy with the influence, right? So then guys strive to have the money, the power, and the influence, right? And it becomes this continuous cycle. And that's why it's so important to have conversations on both sides of the table.
If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to kind of circle back and talking about men who experience violence for just a moment, because when you look through the statistics surrounding intimate partner violence, there's a noticeably higher number of women reporting experiencing violence than men. So, in what ways do pressures of masculinity contribute to this?
It's the whole notion going back to, as men, we're expected to be in control at all times. We're expected to be power. So the minute that we report and say, hey, this woman is abusing me, dude, where's your power? Dude, where's your strength? You know what I mean? All these things. And again, our manhood becomes questioned. One thing that we are working with our communities to make sure men feel safe to tell that story and to change that narrative. Even within the IPV field, there's still some work to be done so that we as professionals understand, yes, men can be victims too. Men are victims of domestic violence and things of that also. I work very closely with the fatherhood community. And that's a situation where, especially in urban communities, the dynamics of power are shifted. Whereas in most traditional parenting situations, mom and dad have equal power. But when you talk about a situation where it's out of wedlock birth, dad doesn't really have any rights. And we see situations where that becomes a power struggle between mom and dad. I've seen where child support can come into it, and child support and the issues of money become a power struggle and dynamic. So these are all conversations that we're having, I think, at the local grassroots level, but also at the systemic level, so that those institutions understand how they're being part of this cycle of violence, right? We want child support to understand, how they can remove themselves from the cycle. We want to make sure that, family and juvenile courts understand how they can remove themselves from that situation as much as possible. We know there are unique situations where they have to step in and, have to enforce, certain rules. But to as much as possible, how can we create a situation where violence just isn't being incited by this very systems that they have to navigate?
100%. Yes. And with over 114 million people reporting experience with intimate partner violence, the CDC reports psychological aggression as the most common form of intimate partner violence. So, knowing this, what can preventionists do to encourage healthy communication skills?
I think for me, and part of the work that I do is expanding the definition of violence. I think oftentimes when you say violence, everybody thinks of the physical, right? Well, they look for a black eye, they look for bruising. And it excludes, like you said, the psychological damage. Things like gaslighting, which is a psychological form of domestic violence, is not something that you're going to find, physically, if that makes sense, right? There are other forms of abuse that, not necessarily psychological, not necessarily physical. I mean, you can cause what they call social harm, right? If I go on social media and I discredit you, or if I share pictures of you nude, things like that, that is causing social harm. That is also violence, right? And it's making sure that we're expanding the definition of violence so that folks understand what violence truly means and can look beyond the physical.
And if it's okay with you, I'd like to take this moment to segue into teen dating violence. Is that
Mhm. Absolutely, yeah.
Great, thank you. So the CDC emphasizes that a significant amount of intimate partner violence starts before someone enters adulthood. And you alluded to that earlier in conversations about, the root cause of some violence actually happens to personal experience, right? So what special considerations should preventionists make when considering a teenage audience?
I think when a teenage audience is all about teaching and communicate what healthy relationships actually look like, making sure teens are equipped with the tools and resources so they can recognize when they're in an unhealthy relationship. 'Cause I think that happens a lot. I think we also need to make sure that young people have the resources that they need so when they do find themselves in that unhealthy relationship, they can get out of it. I think oftentimes the young people feel trapped in those situations because they don't have the resources. They don't know, what opportunities I can have. The last thing I would really encourage for communities and for adults who work with young people is make sure you're what we call an askable adult. Are you an adult that young people can approach, have a conversation with, and not be immediately punitive or, what's the word I'm looking for? Just be understanding, be able to listen, and be rational. Oftentimes, young people are scared to tell those stories because they think they're going to immediately, face some sort of punitive consequences or that they're going to be ridiculed for the situation that occurred.
Yeah. In addition to young people, the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey found that people who identify as lesbian, gay, and bisexual experience rates of intimate partner violence higher than their heterosexual peers in all categories. So, knowing this, what can preventionists do to successfully reach the lesbian, gay, and bisexual audience?
I think the most important thing is partner, partner with the entities and resources that that community has. So here locally in Columbus, we do a good job of partnering with folks like Bravo, Stonewall, and Equitas who specialize in working in that community. They know every community is different. And oftentimes it comes down to the messenger. If you're not the right messenger to reach that community, they're probably not going to hear you, right? So we partner with folks who are tapped into that community, are part of the community. I think that's a huge tool, like folks that are part of the community. There are some very unique populations all around the state of Ohio when we talk about different ethnic groups, whether it's, rural, suburban, and finding individuals who represents the communities that you want to reach is essential to really reaching that particular community.
Yeah, and I suppose your answer is to that question is really good for this one because recent research has also found that transgender individuals also experience rates of intimate partner violence as higher rates than those who identify as cisgender. So, what special considerations should be made for those individuals who are transgender?
I'm so glad you asked that question because this is a huge issue for me personally. This is something that came up probably about 2 or 3 years ago. There was a real popular TV show that myself and a couple buddies I went to college with, we all kept up with. We're playing poker one night, and I asked, "Hey, how'd you guys feel about the last episode?" And one of the guy goes, "Oh man, I can't watch that crap anymore. They keep forcing this gay agenda." And I look kind of like, "What?" I'm like, if it was so to give you some background on the context, it's this particular episode or season, they were featuring a homosexual male couple. One of the guys was an African American urban male who was also very, I guess, street and gangster, which kind of mess with their psyche because again, we are a society who lives on stereotypes. Well, if he's a gay male, he has to fit within this box. Well, this guy did not fit inside the box. So there was issue there. So I really wanted to start to challenge some of the homophobia I've seen around cis males. I've always had a comfort level. People are people, but I've seen in our culture and our society where people take it's very unfortunate, when people are different, we start to distance ourselves from them. We start to point the finger at them. And we need to really, I think at the end of the day, the situation comes down to a lot of cis, especially men, just don't have relationships with men within the LGBTQ plus community because we distance ourselves from them. We are very intentional to distance ourselves from them. So I'm being intentional about how do I create conversations between these two groups, cis men, LGBT men, so that there's some safety, there's some comfort around the two groups, right? And there's not this consistent fear for one another, right? Those men in the LGBTQ plus community are fearful of the violence that cis men create. Cis men are fearful of the LGBTQ plus community because they don't want it to influence their own personal masculinity, right? I remember having this conversation. I challenged a couple buddies. It was 2 years ago. I said, "Hey, the Pride Parade is going on this weekend. We should go down and support the Pride Parade." And they're like, "Oh no, I'm not going to the Pride Parade." And I'm like, "Dude, you can't catch gay. Like, you understand? You can't catch it. Like, we're just going in to support, saying, like, to show as cis straight men that we don't have an issue with that. We can love, we can hug, and we can be supportive of other communities, that's not our own."
Mm. So interesting when our personal lives and our professional lives kind of intersect.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And that's one of the things I love about this work. It is passion driven, but it's driven by life experience. It's all life experience.
Absolutely. Well, Glenn, this has been such an informative podcast for me, but I am sure our folks listening at home have found it informative as well. Well, I'm sure there's so much more we could discuss. It's time for us to start thinking about wrapping up our conversation. With that, I have one final question. Given the complex and multifaceted nature of intimate partner violence, what are some of the most promising strategies or emerging trends and prevention efforts that we can look forward to in the coming years?
I'll give you two. So the first one I'll give you is bystander intervention. Creating individuals or equipping individuals in communities who have the courage, the resources, and the knowledge to intervene when they see the potential for violence. Whether it's a racist joke, whether it's a misogynistic statement, creating situations where men and women can step up, voice, "Hey, that wasn't cool, that wasn't appropriate," so we can start to change the knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs that people have. The second thing that we can do is what we call change the dominant stories. Our culture and our society is led by dominant stories that we are kind of ingrained in us from a very early age. To give you an example of that is boys don't cry. That's something I started learning at 3, 4 years old. So I would suppress my pain, I would suppress my trauma so that I wouldn't have tears, right? We need to change that dominant story. That it is perfectly okay for young men and boys to cry. One of the things I do personally on social media, anytime I find a news clip or something on YouTube of a adult male crying, I'll share it because I want communities to see men crying. A couple years ago when Kobe Bryant passed, Shaquille O'Neal, who's like 6'4", or excuse me, 7'2", 340 pounds, is on national TV crying about his friend that just passed, right? I shared it on social media. It's perfectly okay. Look, Shaq is 320 pounds and 6'7" 2". If he can cry, so can you, right? So it's kind of changing that notion, allowing young men and boys to experience the full range of emotions, not just anger, frustration, and those negative ones that were typically okay for us to share. And us as a community, culture, and society to embrace that change, and say, yes, this is okay. We are accepting of this new definition of masculinity. And it's not all about being tough. It's not about being hard. It's not all about having power, control, and influence and money.
Oh, Glenn, you know what? I think that is a great place to end this conversation on. I just really think that you gave an example and then you gave some background of some things we have to look forward to in the future. And that's what gives us hope, right? Is that we can come together as individuals, cultures, and communities to be the change that we want to see in masculinity. So thank you.
100%. 100%. Know better, do better, be better.
There you go. A tradition that we have here on the Prioritizing podcast at the end is to ask our guests a few rapid fire questions to close our conversation. Today, we've discussed some serious and challenging aspects of masculinity and relationships. And in that, it's important to remember that personal growth and positive relationships are essential parts of life. And that's what I took away from our conversation today. So let's take a lighter moment to explore some hypothetical scenarios and see what your preferences might be. Would you rather be able to read minds or be able to communicate your feelings perfectly?
I'd rather communicate my feelings perfectly. I think I've navigated life quite a bit, sometimes feeling misunderstood. So if I could fix that and speak more clearly, and I think that would change a lot of situations for me.
Would you rather have the ability to always stay calm under pressure or be able to solve any problem?
I think I would have to go with be able to solve any problem. I grew up, one of my favorite songs ever written is a song called by John Lennon called Imagine. And it's, imagining this perfect world, right? And if I could change those things, I would.
Would you rather to be able to learn a new skill quickly or be able to remember everything you've ever learned?
Wow. Probably learn a new skill quickly. Yeah, I'm leaning with learn a new skill quickly, and I say that because we live in a technology age, and technology is always changing. There's new things always coming up, and to be able to stay on top of that would be, I think, just professionally, it would be definitely awesome, and I think even personally, it kind of puts you ahead of the curve.
Oh, thank you, Glenn, so much. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I appreciate you sharing your time and expertise and experience with us. Thank you to our listeners for joining us on the Ohio Center of Excellence for Behavioral Health Prevention and Promotion podcast, Prioritizing Prevention. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to help support the podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star rating, sharing it with others, posting about it on social media, or setting the podcast to automatically download on your favorite channel. Doing so helps us reach more listeners and keeps the conversation going. To catch all of the latest from the center, follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, X, and Facebook at OH Prevention COE, or visit us at preventioncoe.ohio.gov to sign up for our monthly newsletter. If you missed our last podcast, it was with Dr. Yarman Ye from the School of Nursing at the University of California at San Francisco and Dr. Melissa Cannon at Western Oregon University. During our conversation, we discussed the concept of third spaces and how third spaces can be used to promote mental health or serve as a venue to deliver evidence-based prevention programming and services to older adults. You can catch this podcast and all of our content on our YouTube channel or your favorite podcast outlet. This podcast was produced by Ivory Lloyd at Global Insight Productions and is supported by Mackenzie Kay and Sarah Kondrak at the Center of Excellence for Behavioral Health Prevention and Promotion. My gratitude to those of you who are behind the scenes for your work to get positive prevention content out into the world.
This has been the Prioritizing Prevention podcast. For more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, Apple Music, and many more. This program is funded by Ohio Mental Health and Addiction Services. And for more information about us, please visit preventioncoe.ohio.gov. Thank you for listening.